Right. Good afternoon. I welcome you all to the Wednesday lecture series. This is the second of the lecture series. Last week, we saw the atomic imagination, and this week, we are going to see the relationship between literature and philosophic thought. And for a long time, literature has been closely aligned with philosophy. Say, today we talk about interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinary studies or transdisciplinary studies and so on. But remember, the whole notion of philosophy as undisciplined knowledge. Philosophy itself as undisciplined knowledge. This thought has been around for a long time. Look at the highest degree that we receive. That is Doctor of Philosophy. Whichever subject or whichever narrow specialization you have, or whatever is your field of specialization, or whatever is the discipline, the highest degree they award you is Doctor of Philosophy. In a way, philosophy encompasses all other subjects. We use this as a generic term, philosophy as a generic term, because there is philosophy related to science, there is philosophy related to history, there is philosophy related to technology, there is philosophy related to our whole way of life. So philosophy has been used as a matrix under which we try to accommodate every other subject. So today we talk about blurred genres, that is bringing many genres together. We are in the days of English studies, and English studies readily accommodates every other branch of subject. In fact, René Descartes, when he wrote The Principles of Philosophy, he has this to say. He likens philosophy to a tree. And he says, this tree, whose roots are metaphysics, whose trunk is physics, and whose branches are from this trunk, and they are the other sciences. And this is a beautiful metaphor. Philosophy being referred to as a tree, and the roots are metaphysics, then the trunk is physics, all other branches are sciences or humanities, whatever you call them. I like this metaphor. So, what is the connection between literature and philosophic thought? I think we have to jog our memory, and we have to go back to, I'm talking about Western philosophy. See, we Indians, we have our own philosophy. The Chinese have their own philosophy. The Koreans have their own philosophical traditions. The Japanese, they have their own philosophical traditions. Now, look at us. As we study English literature, somehow or other we are expected to have at least some knowledge about Western philosophy. So we'll go back to olden times, and it all begins with Socrates. So I keep Socrates as my starting point, because there were other philosophers whom we can simply refer to as pre-Socratic traditions. There were philosophers before Socrates, but we will have Socrates as our starting point and see the relationship. Now, Socrates has this famous dictum, know thyself. Know thyself. The unexamined life is not worth living. Now, what does it say? We have to examine our own lives, and as we examine how we conduct ourselves, how we think, how we behave, all these things matter. So, now what is the role of a philosopher then? Or what is the role of philosophy? Now, one is to seek the truth and to follow it wherever it leads. So, the idea of philosophy is to seek the truth and follow it wherever it leads. So, we do not know where it will lead us. So, that goes without saying. One thing will lead to another, and another will lead to another. So, it is an unending process. But remember, man is a rational animal. This is the starting point. And Socrates, for a very long time, he had these dialogues with his disciples. And there were many of his disciples. Chief among them was Plato. Plato was his illustrious student that we all know. So, Socrates, for the most part, was an exploratory philosopher rather than a dogmatic philosopher. He was exploring many fields during his discussions with his students. The dialogues that he had with his students, they were so fruitful, they were exploring many subjects. So he was an exploratory philosopher, unlike his students who went and distinguished themselves by starting various schools of philosophy. Okay. Around this time, there was a group of people who could be simply called sophists. S-O-P-H-I-S-T-S. Now, who were these sophists? Now, the sophists were um, philosophers, and they were wandering philosophers. They would move from one place to another, and they would give talk, or they would give a talk on any subject using a very fanciful language. And people gathered around them to listen to their views. And in fact, they were all wonderful orators. They were wonderful, today to use this modern term, they were wonderful sophists. Sometimes their arguments were hair splitting, but they loved their own way of delivering. They loved their own discussion. So they were there, the sophists were there. And many people thought Socrates was one such sophist, but he was much more. And he was discussing with his students till the end, till he was condemned to drink poison, till the last moment of his death. He was surrounded by his own students. And he was charged of impiety and corruption, and especially corrupting the minds of the youth of the city of Athens. That was the charge leveled against him. Okay, so that was Socrates. And there was this sophist by name Protagoras, another sophist who was a contemporary of Socrates. And he had this to say: man is the measure of all things. So we can, to use a modern term without offending anyone, we can say human is the measure of all things. So ultimately, the philosophy is for who? It is for us, humans. It is nothing but a view or an idea related to our life. It's a life principle. In short, it's a life principle. So the idea of seeking truth, the idea of exploring the human mind and how the human mind thinks and how the human mind acts with the help of language, of course. And as humans, we find it very difficult to plumb the depths of human mind, how it works, and what are the things that aid in its thinking. So we'll look at a few things. We'll start with Plato. Now, Plato, he had written his Republic and many other works. But I want to place before you his unknown works. For instance, he has written something like Charmides. That's the title of his work, and it is concerned with temperance, the human mind, how it works, of the temperance. Then another work, it is titled Laches, Laches. It discusses courage, the courage to live, the courage to face death. It talks about that. Then Pro, another important book, it talks about piety. So people believe in God and it talks about piety. Now, look at Plato. When he wrote his Republic, uh, he was writing about, among all the virtues, he says this, he was writing about being a just person. He was talking about the whole concept of justice. So this was a different Plato I'm talking about. And he says, justice is the most important quality for a human being. You can establish justice in the world only when you are a just being. You are just towards others, you are just towards the world. And a just person is far happier than an unjust one. So here comes the divide of what is good and what is bad. And it is this just person who goes and sees what good really is. It is not what seems to be good, according to Plato. There are many things which seem to be good, but they are not exactly good. But what good is? So, if you are a just person, you would go and seek what this good is, and in a just soul or in a just individual soul or personality, there are, of course, desires. He talks about three kinds of desire in the mind of a just person. Now, let's see what these are. See, my presentation is going to be rather sketchy because I have a lot to cover, but I encourage you to read more based on my talk. So, first is, he says, the desire of a reason, the desire of a reason. Mark this verse. We will be using these words like reason, moral, conscience, right, sensations, perceptions in the next 30 or 45 minutes or so. So, he talks about the desire of reason for knowledge and orderliness. This is the prime of all desires, the desire of reason for knowledge and orderliness, that is orderliness in mind, orderliness in the world. Then he talks about the desire of spirit. This is the whole concept of thymos. Now, what is this thymos? That is, we all want to be treated as equal. We all want to be treated as equal with others. We all want to be known as humans on par with other humans. Okay, so this is the human spirit that dwells within us. So he talks about this desire and this thymos, he says, the desire of spirit for self-defense. Say who I am, what I stand for, right. So now this one, then he talks about the third one, that is the desire for bodily appetites. There are many bodily appetites, I don't have to explain, including our desire for food, a desire for sex, a desire for music. So all those things which are called bodily appetites. So Plato talks about a just person, a person who goes after justice. Then he talks about within that person there are desires, and any person wants to fulfill this desire, and that is possible only in a polis, P-O-L-I-S, that is in a city. And he says, in this city state or polis, right, he says, because The Greeks organized themselves in such a fashion. They organized themselves as a society, as a polis. And how it is organized, you need to have the philosopher rulers. We talk about philosopher statesmen. Okay, when Dr. S. Radhakrishnan was the president of our country, we call him a philosopher president, a philosopher statesman. So the Greeks keep prescribes for the Greek cities, philosopher rulers, then the military, and then comes the artisans and soldiers and farmers and farmers. Okay, philosopher rulers, soldiers and military, then the artisans and farmers. Now, this is a system which he talks about. Only in such a society an individual can be just. So, to have such a society, we need to have a philosopher ruler, and the knowledge that you acquire is based on what he calls rationality. Right. So, now we move on to his student Aristotle. Aristotle has written many things, but one of them is Nicomachean Ethics. So, now in this Nicomachean Ethics, he says, there is Plato, but there still is truth. Say, the role of a philosopher is to seek the truth and to go after it where the truth leads you. So he has this to say. Of course, I love my teacher. There is Plato, but there still is truth. And what he has to say, for the first time, you come across a systematic treatment of ethics in Western civilization, Nicomachean Ethics. It prescribes, and it prescribes the way we ought to live, the way we ought to conduct ourselves. Now, look at that. I will tell you more about the people, the Stoics and others a little later. But for him, this duality of potentiality and actuality. He uses this concept of potentiality and actuality. He gives this example. For instance, he says, the acorn actualizes itself or its unique potentiality by becoming an oak tree. Say, an oak tree, when it is smaller in size, we call that an acorn. It is capable of realizing its potentiality. And how it actualizes its potential, he talks about. So, now, as he says, when you try to actualize your potential, you have a disciplined way of living. Without discipline, you cannot actualize. So, now human discipline, discipline of mind, discipline of body, both of them matter. And according to Aristotle, happiness depends upon the actualization. A human being becomes happy only when that person actualizes his or her potential. See, very often we talk about later day philosophers, later day corporate trainers. They very often use this term self-actualization. Even Abraham Maslow, he is on record talking about self-actualization. So all of us humans have this need, this self-actualization need. And Aristotle talks about this actualization need, and happiness depends upon this actualization, the full realization of one's potentiality and also one's rationality. Everything hinges on having or possessing a rational mind, a mind that can see the difference, right? So now between good and bad, a mind that can see the difference, say, and which uses logic, say. In the case of Aristotle, the word logic uh, finds prime importance. Say, after all, in good old days, they taught in universities and even in such centers, study centers or places, three things: logic, rhetoric, and grammar. Say, logic, rhetoric, and grammar. This was the old trivium. It was followed by what we call quadrivium. They added few more subjects. Almost till the 14th century, they taught these three subjects alone. Then they added what we call quadrivium. Now, that is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So now, if you want to study arithmetic, if you want to study geometry, if you want to study music, and above all astronomy, you need to have a mind that is driven by logic, or in the case of Aristotle, it is either logic or your rational mind. Then came another great school of thought. See, there were people. Say, for instance, Plato had his own academy that students like Aristotle and others gathered. Then you had Aristotle, who had his Lyceum, as he called it, Lyceum, where scholars gathered. Now, they had their own places. Places are centers of education, centers of learning. Okay. Another important person was Epicurus. After Plato, Aristotle, you have a person like Epicurus. Now, somehow or other, we associate Epicurus with a hedonist philosophy. But I'll tell you the distinction. Say, many people condemn Epicureanism as a kind of a swinish philosophy. It talks about eat, drink, laugh, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. So now these are all related to animals, appetites related to animals, not exactly related to humans. But you need to understand Epicurus. Epicurus doesn't talk about intense pleasures. Unlike another student of Socrates, his name was Aristippus. Now, this man, Aristippus, though he was a student of Socrates, he advocated a philosophy that was a hedonist philosophy. After all, we humans are here in this world to seek pleasure and to avoid pain at all costs. So, it is the pleasures of the body. And this doctrine was called Cyrenaic doctrine. Cyrenaic, put or propounded by or put forward by this person. His name was Aristippus. And Aristippus advocated the intensity of pleasure. Later, Foucault also borrows the same concept and he talks about intensity of pleasure. And this intensity of pleasure could be momentary, it could be transient, and it could be passing. Whereas Epicurus says, that is, it is not, he maintains rather, it is not the duration of pleasure, right, that matters, that is a short duration. He says it is how long it lasts matters. See, the pleasure of the mind, it cannot be momentary. You cannot go back to your pain again. So, he says that in a way, the duration of pleasure is more important than the intensity in achieving happiness. Okay, so you are happy means You have a happy frame of mind, and this happiness lasts for a long time. He uses the term ataraxia, Ataraxia. Now, ataraxia, by which he means a mind freed from trouble, or freedom from trouble in the mind and freedom from pain in the body. Now, this is Epicurus. Now, remember, Epicurus or Epicurean philosophy is different from the Cyrenaic doctrine propounded by Aristippus, and Aristippus' doctrine was impinging on the intensity of pleasure, whereas Epicurean doctrine is about a lasting happiness. He doesn't even talk about pleasure. Okay, it is pleasure, but only when you have this freedom from trouble in your mind and pain from your body, you can experience this happiness, and it is a long-lasting happiness. So, he says, unhappiness comes, this is Epicurean thought, unhappiness comes either through fear or through vain and unbridled desire. Unhappiness comes, mark his words, either through fear or through vain or unbridled desire. There is no control. If there is no self-control, and if you go on pursuing pleasure, then you will come to unhappiness. Even that pleasure will not satisfy you. You will seek more and more and more and more and more. It could be wealth, it could be a sensual pleasure. You will be seeking more and more, and there is no point of satisfaction, and that produces unhappiness. So he says one needs to possess a mind, a happy mind, which is control, and for this control you have to exercise prudence. Now, his concept of exercising prudence. Prudence means you should know where to draw the limit. You should know how to mark your ambitions. See, and you have to say draw a line somewhere, and you cannot expect beyond those. So, the overall virtue we should seek is to cultivate prudence. Now, this is Epicurus. So, I'll be telling you more about this Greek philosophers before we pass on to English philosophers and their connection with literature. The next important person is Epictetus. Epictetus. Now, who is this Epictetus? He was a Roman Stoic. Yes, Stoicism, you should know what Stoicism is. I'll read out this small definition of Stoicism. Perhaps you can understand. That is, it is a doctrine that man's only worthwhile aim is virtue. The only worthwhile aim is virtue, and this involves submitting to nature and suppressing one's emotions. You should not allow your emotions to have a free ride. You need to control your emotions, control your passion. According to Epictetus, Stoicism is the citadel of the soul. So, the ancient Greeks, they practiced Stoicism, and in fact, Epictetus developed his philosophy from a Greek philosopher. Epictetus was a Roman Stoic. He developed his philosophy from a Greek philosopher by name Zeno, Z-E-N-O. Now, Zeno, he founded what we call Stoa Poikile, S-T-O-A, Stoa, P-O-I-K-I-L-E. What does it mean? It means a painted porch. This was his home, perhaps the front part of his home, the porch, where people gathered. See, I told you, Plato had his academy, Aristotle had his lyceum, Epicurus had his garden, and Zeno had his painted porch. So, Epictetus was greatly influenced by him, and he was a Stoic. And it is, remember, he was led by another disciple of Socrates. His name was Antisthenes. A-N-T-I, Antisthenes, S-T-H-E-N-E-S. So he was a disciple of Socrates. He was a Stoic, and he subscribed to this doctrine which emphasized self-discipline and stressed virtue for its own sake. If you are going to be virtuous, it is not that you are going to reap some reward. You expect some reward. You are virtuous because that is the best thing that you can do, right? Not expecting some reward or award in its place. So, and he is very clear, it is virtue for its own sake, and the people who value virtue for its own sake is happy. Not someone would appreciate you for your virtue, not someone would sing your praise for your virtue. You are virtuous because that is what as a human that you can do. Virtue for the sake of virtue. And he says, virtue is a condition of the will. Say, all of us humans are endowed with this power to will, with this willpower. So, virtue is a condition of the will wherein it is governed by reason. It is not virtue, just like that. It is governed by reason. You exercise your reason. Say, now if you think stealing someone's property is wrong, you are governed by a reason. That reason tells you it is not your property. It is someone's property. And that wealth or property is created by someone by dint of hard work. And you haven't earned that. You have no right to that. So you cannot covet someone's wealth. So now, if you exercise virtue, you apply reason. Say, I'm not wandering into religion. This is what the Greeks taught. This is what the Greeks believed. So, virtue is a condition of the will wherein it is governed by reason. So, and again, if you are virtuous, you are naturally happy. Not because someone praises you and you are happy. You are happy because you are virtuous, and happiness requires unremitting self-discipline. Every day, you have to discipline yourself. It's not that you were virtuous yesterday, you were virtuous 2 years ago, or virtuous 20 years before, but you have to have a consistency in your state of virtuosity. So, according to Epictetus, will alone is wise, in the will alone is virtue. It is your will. By exercising your will, you become virtuous or you become vicious. So, and he says, to establish this moral primacy of the will, he says, you need to have this self-discipline. Look at Epicurus, there is no discipline. You seek, you go after pleasure, you go after happiness. But here, if you are a Stoic, you go after virtue, and being virtuous makes you happy. Right. So now he says, What makes a human being unhappy? It is your frustration. Frustration at what? That is your frustration based on false judgments. Now, when do you become frustrated? Say, because you think you are not able to achieve something. You think you are not able to realize something. The best thing you can realize is your virtue. But because of your false judgment, the consequence of false judgments are many. Say, um, he says, when you look at the world, when you try to relate yourself with the world, you make certain false judgments. And as a result, you feel frustrated because you are trying to control what is uncontrollable. You need to control, right? See, control your mind. You need to control your thoughts. So, but failing which, you feel frustrated, as a result of which you feel unhappy. So, this is what he has to say for a stoic. Develop apathy. Develop apathy. Now, what do you mean by develop apathy? Now, we are in a world where we are encouraged to be sympathetic, where we are asked to practice empathy. But the Stoics, they say, you cannot change the world. You can change a few things. But say, you can explore certain things, but you cannot as an individual. So it is a kind of a studied carelessness. Now, what do you mean by studied carelessness? You know what it is, but you develop an indifference and unperturbability. Don't get unnecessarily disturbed or mentally disturbed. So, if you are a Stoic, say this is one strand of philosophy, so don't get trouble. This is one way of thinking. That is, you remain aloof from the world, though you are in the world. Don't allow your passions or emotions to occupy your mind. Control your emotions. Practice self-discipline. And according to the Stoics, if you are one such person, then you have reached a perfect state of mind. Okay, so we have seen the four basic schools of Greek philosophy and the Roman followers. So you read a lot more. Say you can even teach Plato one full semester. I'm just giving you, or even Socrates one full semester, or even 2 semesters. But I'm just giving you something so that you can understand how the thoughts and how these nuggets of wisdom of the ancients influence the minds later. So now from there, we'll move on to England. Say, in the 14th century, remember after Norman conquest and anything, the English language had by then well developed during the 14th century. We talk about the great vowel shift and so on. The Chaucer had already written a beautiful piece, namely Canterbury Tales in medieval English. He had written other works as well. The language had developed by then. For the first time, we come across a philosopher. His name is William of Ockham. He hails from a place called Ockham, O-C-K-H-A-M, William of Ockham. Now, what is this O-C-K-H-A-M? Say, he was a great philosopher. I told you, around this time, logic, rhetoric, and grammar were taught in universities. So, he talks about the usage of language, how language is used, how you use your language. So, he has this to say, this philosophical principle to offer, wherein he says, you have to use language minimally. That is, language in its simplest form and most sparing of terms. no superfluousness in language, right? No extra wordings, no beating about the bush. If you are going to wield Occam's razor means your language is sharp, your language has that cutting edge. So, and brevity. Later, Shakespeare in his Hamlet talks about brevity as the soul of wit, or brevity is the soul of wit. So, use minimum number of words. Perhaps this was a philosopher offering his advice, rather a philosophical principle of using less of language, but within that language, how you have to contain your thoughts. Okay, now that is William of Ockham, the earliest philosopher. You have to wait for the next 2 or 3 centuries before you come across other philosophers. For example, you have someone like Robert Burton. When you come down to the 17th century, you come across a person like Robert Burton, who wrote his Anatomy of Melancholy. Excuse me. He wrote his Anatomy of Melancholy. Right. This was a treatise on melancholy. It was a study on melancholy, which was read by Coleridge and many other people who came after them, uh, where he chose a particular topic, melancholy, a state of mind, almost an unhappy state of mind where you are sad, you fail to cheer yourself. And today, very often we talk about depression. Now, this depression is almost synonymous with your melancholic state. Okay, so now the whole idea of melancholy, it finds a wonderful treatment in Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. But I'm interested in another person. His name was Thomas Hobbes. We can safely call him the first major English philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, who wrote his Leviathan, 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 saying, according to him, all mental operations are only motion. It is movement. As I talk to you now, my mind, well, maybe it is ignited to talk on a particular topic, but it is in an excited state. See, there are many invisible atoms. They are at a random moment. We do not know. And Thomas Hobbes contributed a lot to modern day psychology and sociology. And in fact, he laid the foundation for modern day sociology. I'll tell you more about that. And according to him, the universe is nothing more than a vast system of motions. Okay, say, now look at our earth, look at our world. They are all in motion, though it appears to remain in a static position without movement. As I am talking to you now, the world is rotating, right? And it is revolving, right? All these two movements happen simultaneously. The earth revolves around the sun and rotates on its own axis, meaning what? It is in a state of motion, right? Though everything appears to be static, everything is in a state of motion according to him. And the universal system itself is nothing but a vast system of motion. Okay, so his philosophy is almost practically equivalent to materialism, and he says the concepts related to the world, that is, the mechanical laws of the world, can be explained through either chemistry or physics. So now this was Thomas Hobbes. Now Thomas Hobbes makes it very clear everything is in a state of motion. In fact, Thomas Hobbes was for creating a kind of discipline that is um, where we can read every subject. Perhaps we can call him the father of interdisciplinary studies or multidisciplinary studies. He doesn't distinguish between study of your mind, study of your society, or science. For him, all can be brought together and we can study. Okay, so for instance, he was impressed by natural philosophy. Say, he simply terms that natural philosophy. So that took him to Copernicus in astronomy and Galileo in physics. And you remember William Harvey in physiology, the man who grouped the blood, human blood, and things like that, William Harvey. Right. So he was interested in all these studies, Thomas Hobbes. This was a lengthy treatise, Leviathan. And in this Leviathan, he also makes a strong defense of absolute monarchy. He gives the ruler full sovereignty over all the affairs of the state. He was for absolute monarchy. Later, his position was challenged by John Locke. That was different. So, now according to him, we all have this social contract. Say, this social contract theory that is attributed to Thomas Hobbes. That is, as an individual, I forgo my complete freedom and I authorize the king or state to take control over my life. Say, as an individual, well, I can conduct myself admirably well. I can follow the rules. I can follow the laws. But these rules and laws are formulated by who? Look at the beginning sentence of Indian Constitution. We, the people of India, give unto ourselves this Constitution. That's how it reads. It is not a group of people who gave us this Constitution, who framed these rules and laws for us to follow. Rather, the people, this is a social contract. It's a social contract theory. We agree to abide by this law and we have created this law. So, and as an individual, I give up my right of governing myself and I allow the king or state and to govern me by giving or by ceding this right to the state. What I do, I try to create a civil authority and law, and according to him, this is the foundation of morality. Right? This social contract, say, now we are all law-abiding citizens, we say. We follow the rule of law, we claim. How? Because the state prohibits certain things, the state allows certain things, the state has given us certain rights, the state has prescribed certain duties, and we agree to follow all this. So, this is a social contract. And when, as a citizen, I follow all this, then that becomes the foundation for my morality, my personal morals. Now, this is Thomas Hobbes. Now, after Thomas Hobbes, see, this book created a sensation. This was the time when Charles I was killed, right? He was that was a regicide. The ruler was killed, right? And for 11 years, there was this Puritan interim. And here is someone who writes about monarchy in defense of absolute monarchy. Okay, you can understand that significance. It affected the literature of that times. Okay, the next important person who lived during the same period was John Locke. He wrote an essay concerning human understanding. See, according to him, the capacity of human mind is limited. But he regarded the mind of a person at birth as a tabula rasa, a clean state. And remember, he says, our knowledge can be gathered only through experience, experiential knowledge. In fact, he was the founder of empiricism, right? Now, right. So, according to him, the human mind only through experience gathers knowledge. So, when he says the mind is a blank state upon which experience imprints knowledge. So, we gather knowledge of the world. How? In our mind, and only through experience. It could be a mental experience, a linguistic experience, or even a physical experience. Then it imprints knowledge on our mind. So, there are two levels of understanding. One, he says, that is ideas of sensation. Now, what is this ideas of sensation? That is, um, through senses, we have five senses, and through these five senses, we gather an impressive data. And you listen to me, this is also something that you gather, and then this one, this gets into your mind, saying through these five senses. He calls that ideas of sensation, right? That alone will not help you to gather knowledge. There are other things, according to him. One, after gathering all this, you have to reflect upon them. That is, perceiving, how you perceive these sensations, how you remember them, and how you compare one with another. That is, he calls ideas of reflection, ideas of sensation, and ideas of reflection. Now, these two can be conjoined at some point, ideas of sensation and ideas of reflection. Thereby, your knowledge becomes purely experiential. Okay, so now, as he founded the school of empiricism, he emphasizes the importance of the experience of senses in pursuit of knowledge rather than intuitive speculation. See, he wants to steer clear of intuitive speculation or deduction. So it should be experiential and no deduction and no speculation, and there is nothing called intuitive knowledge. Now, this is according to John Locke. Of course, John Locke rebutted Thomas Hobbes' idea of absolute monarchy, and he attacked the theory of divine right of kings. See, many kings, they thought they were divine representations on earth, and they had this divine rule, uh, divine sanction to rule over people. Okay, so he rebutted that. And for instance, John Locke's many of his ideas were later taken up, and especially these two treatises of government. They proved to be highly influential when the Americans framed their constitution. Okay, now John Locke, a very important philosopher who lived during the 17th century. So across the English Channel, there was another philosopher, and his name was Descartes, Rene Descartes. So you must have heard of this Cartesian thinking, but I want to tell you something about Rene Descartes. In fact, he was a first order mathematician. He was a great mathematician, and he was a natural philosopher and also a metaphysical thinker. Now, He wrote almost tract-like books. One is titled Rules, the other one is titled Discourses, the third one is Meditations. So, and he discussed the roles of cognitive faculties. Say, people are talking about sensations, applying rationality. He was talking about cognitive faculties, that is, in and the role of cognitive faculties in acquiring knowledge. In short, he was talking about a place for intellect. I'll explain it further. So, now, what is this cognitive faculty? This includes your intellect, your imagination, your sense perception, and memory, right? Of course, all are aided by language. We should not forget this fact. And he wrote his principles. And here, um, I think I told you about this whole concept of philosophy being a tree that appears in this work, Principles. Okay, so now with him, philosophy takes what we can safely say an epistemic term. Now, what is episteme? Episteme is nothing but knowledge, a study of knowledge. Later, Foucault also uses episteme, right? Saying we cannot escape from the influence of philosophers, thinkers, philosophers who lived before us. Say, for instance, how can we, if you happen to be a Tamil, how can you escape from the influence of Tirukkural in your everyday life? We cannot escape from the influence of Tirukkural. Wherever you go, with whomever you talk, you are always reminded of some Kural or other thing. If you happen to be a religious person, you will be certainly reminded of the religious philosophy with which you have grown up, with which you have been brought up. There is no escape. So, now come back. According to Descartes, there is no escape from your intellect. Now, so he says, he denied that the senses reveal the nature of substances. See, just we cannot understand the world only through our senses. This is his point. We cannot understand the world. Say, only the human intellect helps you to perceive the nature of reality. Without your human intellect, you cannot perceive reality. And if you want to understand the world, it has to be purely an intellectual perception, right? An intellectual perception. Now, without your intellect, you cannot understand the world. It is difficult to understand the world. See, these are all many of these positions adopted by philosophers, or rather theoretical positions adopted by philosophers. So, he says, I'll just read out. In order to procure the fundamental truths of metaphysics, we must withdraw the mind from the senses. Do not allow your mind to be controlled by senses. Instead, allow your mind to be controlled by intellect. And he says, of course, you know, he used that famous slogan-like term, cogito ergo sum. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This appears in his meditations. It's one of his works in his meditation. It appears. So he sets up clear and distinct intellectual perception. And this is absolutely independent of the senses. And this is the mark of truth. This is Descartes. Descartes. Okay. Now, he was a great philosopher, right? his thinking influenced people. And as students of literature, very often in our literary theory classes and other classes, teachers make a reference to philosophers. And we need to have a very basic understanding of philosophers. You can read more and more of philosophy and you can develop a philosophical bent of mind that is left to you. But in order to understand literature, in order to understand the creative genius of writers and the influence on their minds, we have to necessarily know philosophies or philosophers. Okay, now come back. In the next century, that is, in the 18th century, there were many philosophers. I'll just point out a couple of them because the time is very short. At least I would like to point out this man. He was from Germany. His name was Immanuel Kant. Now, Immanuel Kant, he has written many books, including Critique of Judgment. He has offered a critique of judgment and critique of practical reason, another work. Then the fundamental principles of the metaphysics of morals. And I'll cut the story short. If you want to understand him, you need to understand this concept of categorical imperative. Now, what is this categorical imperative? This is to understand Immanuel Kant. I will explain that. See, he says, if you ought to be a moral being, there ought to be a kind of consistency. Now, consistency as the core of the fundamental moral. And how is this achieved? How do you achieve this consistency, which he calls categorical imperative? Now, I behave in a certain manner because of this categorical imperative. I have certain values, I have certain virtues, all determined by this categorical imperative. Right. So, now what is this categorical imperative? Now, this categorical imperative is made possible by his basic premise, which is called goodwill. Now, what is goodwill? Goodwill towards the world, goodwill towards fellow human beings, right? Now, what is this goodwill? This is an idea. That is, I do good and I will do good. And why I do good? The goodwill is not good because it achieves good results, right? Because from a state of goodwill, I do and it achieves good results. And because it achieves good results, it is not good. Even if it were not able to attain it, the end it seeks, that is something good, still it would be good in itself. Okay, I try to help someone, right? My intent is good. I have goodwill, but it doesn't produce the intended result. I always joke with my students, right? My goodwill is to make you pass sometimes your NET or SET exams, but my goodwill ends there. I'm not able to get a job for most of them with the UGC scale of pay. I laugh with them, right? My intent is good. My goodwill is to help you get a job with the UGC scale of pay. My goodwill is there, but I don't succeed always. I don't succeed all the time. I'll give you a better example. Your goodwill is one which acts, right, for the sake of duty. Why is this goodwill? It is not because I'm a good person, because I have a certain motivation, or because I have certain inclination. It is my duty. So now from a state of duty, I do good. And indeed, human actions have inner moral worth only when they are performed from duty. Say, my goodwill has intrinsic moral worth when I think this is my duty. See, Perhaps I'll give you an example. Kant is not a very difficult thinker to understand. Say, I was reading in the newspaper about a postman by name Sivan. He was working for a long time in Nilgiris district. He would walk even to remote villages to deliver his the letters or money order or anything. And why did he do this? And at times he had to cross elephant corridors where he would apply the waste of elephant on his body so that the elephants would not recognize his smell, human smell. Why did he do this? Why did he take such a risk? He had this goodwill, but this goodwill stemmed from duty, because this is duty and it's his duty as a postman, and it is his goodwill which resulted in good deeds. So now anything, your goodwill, it may not produce results that you see, but goodwill is sufficient enough, and that goodwill ought to be performed from duty, and we need to have this respect for duty. Okay, according to him, if you have this, right, goodwill, or what he calls this categorical imperative, say, the imperative is one ought to tell the truth. That is an imperative. One ought to tell the truth as a matter of principle. It always says categorical imperatives, you should do it, you ought to do it. Okay, one ought to tell the truth. Now look at the second statement. If you want to avoid punishment, you ought to tell the truth. Look at the difference. One ought to tell the truth, that is goodwill, right? It is a categorical imperative. But if you want to avoid punishment, you ought to tell the truth. Look at the second one. This is also a kind of an imperative, but a hypothetical imperative, not a categorical imperative. But he stands for categorical imperative. You tell the truth, right? Not to avoid punishment, not to receive any reward, because telling truth is goodwill, right? Okay, or categorical imperative. So, and he says, the immediate object of a reason is to produce goodwill. Reason, people talk about reason or rationality. He says the immediate object of a reason is the production of goodwill, which he calls supreme good. This production of goodwill itself is supreme good, or what he calls supremum bonum. Supremum bonum. A person of, he agrees, a person of goodwill, he deserves happiness. See, when I have goodwill, what is the natural expectation? That I will be happy. So, the supreme good conjoined with happiness in proportion contributes to greatest good, that is summum bonum. Greatest good, happiness, greatest happiness. Okay, now, after explaining Kant, if I go and tell you about John Stuart Mill, you will understand. John Stuart Mill talks about the greatest happiness principle. In other words, that is called utilitarianism. Now, what is utilitarianism? Or the greatest happiness principle, saying when Jeremy Bentham, perhaps you know about Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was the father of this philosophy, that is utilitarianism, utility. Greatest happiness principle, that is, what does it say? You do as much good to as many people. You do as much good to as many people. And if you do that, you will produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. Look at all our political programs and social welfare programs. They are all intended to produce happiness of a large number of people. So, and the ultimate criterion for the production of such happiness is through legislation or through social action or through social institution. I'll cut the story short. So now look at this development of philosophy. I'll stop here with the John Stuart Mill, right? And other philosophers of that age. You come across something called Darwinism. You come across something called Marxism or communist or socialist philosophy, which were all derivatives of Marxist thinking. So I'm not going to discuss Marxism now, but this was a philosophy which evolved during this 19th century. And Marx says how we are all condemned to labor, and how there are class divisions in society, and how economy is the base for everything, even for our culture to develop, even for our thinking to develop, and even for our society. Everything else is a superstructure, the civilization that we have built. And again, he has introduced a lot of terms like commodification, alienation, false consciousness. You go to Marx, you come across many such terms. Now, Darwinism, you have something called social Darwinism and many such things. Right, look at the 19th century. All this have had their impact on literature. When people wrote literature, philosophy itself is literature in prose form. I always tell my students, philosophy is literature in prose form. We give a lot of importance to drama, lot of importance to poetry, lot of importance to fiction or stories, right? Do we give importance to prose? How is prose available to us? Only in the form of essays? That's what our curriculum says. Most of our college and university curriculum, they tell us prose is represented only in the form of essays, not in the form of treatises, not in the form of philosophy. See, that is the fourth one. When we talk of prose, this is also literature, right? And somehow or other, we have become indifferent to prose. Look at all our PhD theses. All our PhD theses they are only on these three, right? Poetry, drama, or fiction, mostly fiction. 85% of our research is on fiction, and hardly 10% on poetry and hardly 5% on drama. So I'm making a strong case for prose. Go and read prose texts. Yeah. So then you will understand. So look at the 19th century. When the 20th century came, we had, many mainstream philosophical thinking. Existentialism was one such philosophical thought or philosophic thought, which had a lasting influence on literature, because this thought, this existentialist philosophy, which was preceded by something like a phenomenology, because the phenomenon is a human mind, that is a phenomenon, right? So the study of your conscience, right? So you go and read Edmund Husserl, or you read someone like Martin Heidegger, who wrote Being and Time, where he talks about being in the world or our thrownness into existence, how we are thrown into this world and we have no choice and over our birth. But as we start living, we start making choices, and it is not that essence that precedes our existence. It is our existence that precedes our essence. And there is this radical freedom which Jean-Paul Sartre talks about. Okay, so now they all had a powerful influence on writers like Samuel Beckett and writers like Albert Camus and many such writers. So you have 20th century philosophy, right? So I have given you just some idea about some of these greatest thinkers of the past. Say within an hour and a half, I can't be giving you a very, very comprehensive, idea about philosophy. But if you want to learn more about philosophy, go and start with the Will Durant's book on philosophy. Will Durant. It will give you some understanding. And philosophy is important. Say, we have something distinct called Indian philosophy, Indian thinking. Now, look at that. Philosophy also travels from one part of the world to another. Look at the transcendental philosophy and transcendentalism, right? When the Germans talked about transcendentalism and when the Americans practiced transcendentalism, you are aware of Emerson, you are aware of Thoreau, you know about Margaret Fuller. They were all transcendentalists, right? And people who talked about something beyond our rational mind, something beyond our intellect, a different realm altogether. And the realm that is beyond the world in which we live. And how I try to see the connection between the universe, the macrocosm, and the individual, the microcosm. It talks about how divinity is present everywhere, how divinity can be found in every living and non-living being, how it permeates the world. Divinity permeates the world. See, transcendentalists, the theory of soul and oversoul, how it influenced. Of course, in our country, we have such a thinking. Okay, so now we have how the Atman joins the Paramatma, right? That the soul joins the oversoul. Many things are related to literature. See, if you have a strong grounding in philosophy, you can understand things better. Every literary theorist, if you happen to read, they quote most of the philosophers of the past. They quote Plato, they quote Aristotle, they quote Immanuel Kant, they quote a person like a Hegel, for instance. Of course, I forgot to tell you something about Hegel, Hegelian idea of dialectic. You remember the Hegelian thought of dialectic? Now, for instance, Hegel's thought of dialectic. It is a method of investigating the truth and the nature of truth by critical analysis. He says, if you propose something, a concept, there is always something opposite to that concept. Then you try to evolve the third one, that is synthesis. Later, people talked about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So there is a dialogue, right? Now Hegel talks about dialectic engagement, which began with Socrates, which continues. Say, there is no finality on any thought system. There is no finality on any philosophical principle. Everything is debatable. Everything is debated except religious philosophy, right? So now when things are debated, there will come a state of synthesis, and this is, according to him, a higher level of truth. So he wrote his Phenomenology of Mind. Hegel wrote a work called the Phenomenology of Mind, where he talks about a universal mind. So what we need today is a universal mind. So that is why philosophy is very important. So if you have to develop a universal mind, a mind which is not simply receptive of every philosophy, but which is capable of subjecting something to a critical analysis. It is not blindly accepting any philosophical point of view. For instance, I may not subscribe entirely to the absurdist or nihilist existential philosophy. It was a thought, it was a philosophy, but I don't think all our human lives are meaningless. That's what existentialist philosophy says. Everything is a meaningless, everything is meaningless, and entire life is meaningless. And of course, the myth of Sisyphus is was borrowed by Albert Camus. And he says, he gives this beautiful example, how Sisyphus, he keeps on pushing the rock back on the incline. Then again, the rock comes down. He pushes it back. And it is a boring job. But finally, he says, one must imagine Sisyphus to be happy. If you think your life is subject to boredom and meaningless, right, that is one way of thinking at your life. But that's not the end of the road. So, philosophy, even today, there are modern day philosophers. There are many philosophers, say, people who talk about the ultimate goodness principle. And I like this man. With him, I will stop. His name was Henry Sidgwick. He was also an English philosopher. Of course, he lived during the 19th century. He talks about four self-evident normative principles. I love this man. I keep reading Henry Sidgwick. I am fond of. This is my choice. He is my choice. He uses this principle called justice principle. Remember, being a just person, right, which Plato talks about, justice principle. In this world, we have to establish justice, and that is, it could be political justice, social justice, justice everywhere. You act from a state of being a just person, justice principle. Then the prudence principle. You have to be prudent. I don't have to explain that. You have to be prudent. Then the third one he says is a rational benevolence. Then it is not that you live only for yourself. You are a social being. That is, you show your love towards others, maybe from the point of goodwill, from the point of duty, as Kant says, rational benevolence, right? Who deserve your love? Who deserve your charity? Who deserve your help? Rational benevolence. Then, finally, he says that is universal pleasure or universal happiness. If you have all this, you will have a state of mind. So ultimately, philosophy should help us to achieve a state of mind, right? Which is purely happy, right? Happiness. And this state of mind should help us to accept even death. You don't get unduly perturbed by even death. Okay? So now that is how your mind should march. That is how your mind should progress. And that's what philosophy should help us to understand. Understand this life. Okay, so now that is a short, rather introductory remarks about philosophy. In the coming weeks also, every Wednesday we will meet, and I'll be talking more about other subjects related to literature. For instance, something like paintings, literature and paintings, literature and architecture. Say, you will be learning some of the things which are not part of our curriculum. Our curriculum doesn't permit us, whether it is an autonomous college or university, it doesn't permit us to learn all this, except for a few colleges here and there in our country. We'll try and learn in order to improve our understanding of literature and life. Okay. Now, thank you for your patient listening. I stop here, and I encourage you to attend these programs regularly and benefit by that. And you can, I like watching your comments on the chat. You can send in your comments and feedback, right? And remember, I'm not good at making PowerPoints, right? Sometimes I love to quote, and I love to quote from my notes, quote from my memory, and so on. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.